Hey guys, today we are going to learn about the legacies of imperialism in Canada. So first, let's talk about what a legacy is. So you can write down that a legacy is something that has been passed down by those who lived in the past. You can put that in your notes. So an example of a legacy might be decisions that were made by your parents or your grandparents, and it affects your life today. So things from the past that affect us today, those are legacies. So some legacies might include the language you speak, which might have been passed down to you from the past, traditions you follow, religion you practice. All of those things might be legacies for you. Okay, so we're talking about legacies of imperialism, right? So there was the Spanish Empire, right? So if you go to this area here, this red area on the map, you're going to see legacies of Spanish imperialism, right? So the language that is spoken in those areas is still predominantly Spanish. There are many people whose ancestors are Spanish in that area. Their forms of government in those areas are, in many cases, based on the type of government that Spain had at the time, right? So these are legacies of their Spanish imperialism, right? And the British as well. They had colonies around the world, and if you go to most of those colonies or most of those countries that used to be colonies of the British Empire, you're going to find that people there might speak English, or maybe English is at least the language of business or the language of government in that country. And in many cases, they use a British form of government, and they might even have like a little British symbol on their flag, right? And the same thing with the French colonies, right? In many parts of the world that used to be colonies of France, maybe they have taken on Catholicism as the dominant religion, right? So that could be a legacy of the French imperialism in that region, right? Same with the Portuguese, right? If you go to Brazil today, they speak Portuguese, right? And they are mainly Catholic as a result of the Portuguese Catholics taking over that part of South America. Okay, so uh, legacies of historical globalization. These are effects of historical globalization that still impact people's lives today. All right, so the goal of this unit is to understand the effects of historical globalization on both indigenous and non-indigenous peoples, right? So we want to know, okay, during the time of imperialism, the time of the second round of globalization, how did this time period affect the lives of both indigenous and non-indigenous people, and what kinds of impacts still exist today as a result of that round of globalization? Okay, so in class, we had a little discussion on the effects of Canada's colonization on both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And then we stepped into the legacies of residential schools. Okay, so residential schools will be the main area of focus for much of this lesson. Right, so before getting into the lesson, I had the class do a little, I guess, survey on how much they know about residential schools. I know it's something that junior highs might have taught you about, but junior high might have been a pretty long time ago, right? And some of you might not have gone to junior high here in Canada, so you might not know about this very well. All right, so take a minute and see if you can answer some of these questions to the best of your ability, right? And then once you've done that, then you can continue with the video. Okay, we talked about some vocabulary in class. I'll briefly talk about all 5 of these terms here. So indigenous is a general term. Indigenous is not a term that um, only only pertains to Canada, right? So indigenous just means it's a group of people whose ancestors were the first people to live in a certain area, right? And so in Canada, our indigenous people include our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations, right? And so there are indigenous communities or indigenous nations in all parts of the world, right? And then Aboriginal, this is a term that is often used in Canada to refer to our indigenous nations. And then the term Native is a term we seem to be kind of moving away from as a society. We're not using that one as much. But in the past, more so, it was a term that was used pretty much synonymously with the word indigenous, right? So it's a term. I think my own general observation is that we're not using native as much. Instead, we're using the term indigenous a little bit more. And then First Nations refers to this idea that these were the first nations to inhabit the territory that is now Canada. And then the word Indian is an old term that we don't use, at least we should not use anymore in Canada. So the term Indian goes back to the idea that with the arrival of conquistadors, the arrival of Christopher Columbus, originally at the very beginning, they thought that they had arrived in India, right? And so they started referring to the local people as Indians. It didn't take long before they realized that they were not in India. However, they continued to refer to the local people as Indians in many cases, however, not everywhere. And so this is an old term that still is used by some people. It's a term that if you are not Indigenous, I strongly urge you not to use this term when referring to Indigenous people. Okay, some Indigenous people might use it, and that is their right, of course. But if you are not Indigenous, this is not a term you should use. But then it's complicated by the fact that this is a term that we still find in a lot of Canada's um, government acts and legal code and all that. Like it's still a legal term that is used in Canada in our government. So it still comes up and we still end up using it in those cases. But if you are referring to a person who is Indigenous, there are other words that are better. Okay. So let's talk about imperialism in Canada. So we talked about it a little bit in the last lesson. We do an extremely brief, an extremely simplified version of Canada's colonization. So overall, we know European explorers and colonists took most of North America's land away from Indigenous populations. And Canada became a colony of the British Empire. This is a bit simplistic. The territory that is now Canada consisted of many different colonies, which were under the control of the British Empire. Okay, so let's start the story in 1763. All right, so with the Royal Proclamation, and you can write the year beside your notes there. In your notes, it says the Royal Proclamation. You can add the year, 1763. So obviously a very, very long time ago. The British government knew they needed to appease the First Nations and find a way to expand settlement without inciting resistance. Okay, so the Royal Proclamation defined Indian territory and rules for expansion of European settlements. So here is a map of the colonies in what is, in part of what is now Canada. And so what you'll notice is that for the most part, most Europeans were living in the eastern part of the continent, and there were not as many European colonists and settlers living in the western part yet, right? So the western part of the continent was still largely inhabited by Indigenous people. And so this Royal Proclamation sort of set the framework to allow for these colonies to expand west into the territory that was mainly occupied by Indigenous people, right? And so they wanted to do so in a way that would not create a revolt among the Indigenous people of the West. Okay, so they set some rules. You can write this one in your notes. Only the crown, meaning only a representative of the monarch, the British monarch, can buy land from First Nations. So, just some regular settler, some regular colonist cannot just go west and start talking to Indigenous people and, wanting to buy their land. It had to be an official representative of the king or queen. Okay, and First Nations, according to the Royal Proclamation, are considered separate and sovereign nations, and they are to be respected, and all the treaty agreements, right, must be upheld. So treaties are written agreements that are signed by two nations. And the Royal Proclamation, part of its whole thing was that there was a nation-to-nation sort of relationship, right? That Britain was one nation and that there were First Nations and they must sign treaties, and that those treaty rights and the agreements that are made in those treaties must be upheld on the side of both parties, including the British. Okay? Things changed. In 1867, uh, Canada is no longer just a colony of Britain. Canada is given its independence. Canada forms its own country, and Canada becomes independent in its domestic affairs, meaning that Canada can now control what it does in Canada without having to get the approval of the British. However, when it comes to foreign affairs and in relations with other governments of the world, Canada is still very much a part of the British Empire in that sense. Okay, so Canada's first prime minister is this guy, John A. Macdonald, and so he becomes Canada's first prime minister, and this is what he has to say about the Indigenous people living in Canada. He says, the Canadian government will do away with First Nations governments and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the inhabitants of the Dominion, right? And so you can see that the goal of the Canadian government is going to be assimilation, right? To make it so that the Indigenous populations in this land are not distinct, are not different, that they lose their identity. Okay, and so one of the important efforts in making this happen is the Indian Act. All right, so just what is that, 9 years after Canada forms its own independent country, they passed the Indian Act, and it makes Indians and the lands reserved for the Indians, now that's a quote directly from the Act, the responsibility of the government, right? So First Nations are now under the control and under the watch of the Canadian government, right? And of course, First Nations were not consulted in any way when this law was passed, right? It's not like First Nations wanted this. It's not like they asked for this. This is something that was imposed on the First Nations by the Canadian government. Okay, so this was developed out of the mistaken assumption that First Nations people were incapable of managing their own affairs, right? So there was this paternalistic view of the Canadian government's relationship with First Nations. The idea was that they believed that the Canadian government had to watch over and take care of, and air quotes on that one, the Indigenous populations in Canada. Right, so the document governed day-to-day life for First Nations. Right, so it really did a lot of things. Like it banned some ceremonies, right? So it banned some traditional Indigenous ceremonies that were part of their culture and spirituality. It regulated Indian status, right? So Indian status, this controls who is considered a First Nations person and who isn't. And we're going to look at some specific examples of this later on. But if you have legal status as a First Nations person in Canada, well, then you are legally entitled to some forms of compensation that come through treaty rights. And so the Indian Act controlled who is First Nations and who isn't. It also imposed the band system, right? So before the Indian Act and before colonization in general, of course, Indigenous nations had their own forms of self-government, right? However, with colonization and then now with the Indian Act, those forms of self-government are now taken away, and they are replaced with a new type of local self-government for First Nations called the band system. And the band system does not have anywhere near the same amount of power as the old forms of self-government, right? So this is a part of imperialism, right? The Canadian government establishing control over the lives of Indigenous nations in Canada, right? It also implemented reserves and enacted residential schools. Okay, so here are some main points from the Indian Act. So it denied women status for marrying non-Aboriginals. Okay, so if a Aboriginal woman would marry a man who is not Aboriginal, well, then she would no longer have her status as an Aboriginal woman. It created residential schools, like we said, it created reserves, and it also restricted the mobility of First Nations people in that there were these people called Indian agents who became in charge of keeping an eye on who is going in and out of the First Nations reserves. It also took away First Nations' right to vote, right? So if a First Nations person wanted to vote, they had to give up their First Nation status. And it forbade political organizations, right? So it restricted freedom of association and freedom of assembly. It also prohibited the sale of alcohol to First Nations people. It imposed the band council system, like we said, and it declared the potlatch as well as other cultural ceremonies illegal. Okay, so we're going to talk about residential schools. But first, let's go back to the Indian Act. The Indian Act, you just saw what it was all about. Well, what was its goal, right? What were they trying to achieve? Well, overall, it would be assimilation. Okay, so this is a quote from Duncan Campbell Scott, and he was superintendent of Indian Affairs. And he says, quote, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question. Education is the forefront of their requirements now." End quote. So the goal here is assimilation, and the main method that's going to be used to assimilate will be residential schools. Right? So you guys have learned about residential schools. You've maybe seen this picture before. The overall goal was to assimilate children, right? To turn them, from this into this, right? This is the same child in both of these photos. And so the first photo is of the child before attending residential schools, and then the second photo is of the child after attending residential schools, right? So you can see the massive transformation taking place, at least on the outside, but many transformations are also taking place on the inside. And the goal is to assimilate children into the dominant European, Canadian, white, Christian culture and worldview that was the dominant way in Canada at the time. Okay, so who ran these residential schools? Well, they were run by Christian churches, including the Anglican, Catholic, United, and Presbyterian churches. Right, so in these schools, children were being forcibly converted into Christianity. All right, here are some photos of families. Here are some photos of the schools themselves and the children in the schools. So who went to these schools? Well, every Aboriginal child between the ages of 5 and 15 years old legally had to go to these schools, right? They did not have a choice. This was not like something that they volunteered for. It was something that they had to go to. And if parents withheld their children, then there would be some legal means in order to forcibly remove the child. Okay, so all in all, 150,000 Aboriginal children across Canada passed through these schools, right? So Aboriginal, like I said, includes First Nation, Métis, and Inuit children. Okay, so the official intention was to civilize, assimilate, and educate the Aboriginal children in the British way of life. The goal was to take them and turn them into British subjects, have them become just like the other European Canadians who lived in the rest of Canada. However, for the most part, these children were not being educated to become, doctors and lawyers and teachers and stuff. Instead, there was this Eurocentric view that Aboriginal children were not going to be capable of taking on those higher level jobs in society. Instead, they were being trained to take on some more like manual labor jobs, domestic low level, low skill types of jobs. That's how they would be training the children. Okay. Then in class, we did a little review because that was the point we were at. I'm going to get you now to, once you're done watching this video, you can go and you can watch the next video in the playlist, which is called Stolen Children. And you can learn by listening to the stories of residential school survivors. And as you do so, you can complete your notes where it says living conditions in residential schools, you should have plenty of room to write as much as you can. As you learn about the living conditions in residential schools, go ahead and write that stuff in your notes. Okay, so that'll be it for this part of the video, and then there will be another part coming out later.